All right, Bellringer fans, living environment fanatics, and friends all around the world, it's time for today's Fun Time Science Bellringer. You know what to do. Stay here, tuned to this YouTube channel. Don't forget to smash that like button. Smash it. Yeah. All right. Hey now. Mr. Kovacs class. It's Mr. Kovacs class. You might learn a ton. It's Mr. Kovacs class.
He's interesting too.
It's Mr. Kovacs class.
And he's super cool.
It's Mr. Kovacs class. So we're wrapping up the ecology unit, and we're going to be talking about abiotic cycles in nature that of the three abiotic components that are really essential: the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the carbon cycle. And my guess is you already know water cycle and carbon cycle, whether you realize it or not. Nitrogen is probably the newest one for you. Let's take a look at all three. Water cycle. All the water that's ever existed on this planet has been recycled for 4.6 billion years. And it's recycled between the ground and the atmosphere and the oceans, and even the plants and animals use water, as you know. So water is a key resource, and we're not going to spend too much time on it, but you should know the basics of the water cycle. You should know the term evaporation. Evaporation is when water molecules become so undense, diffuse, that they become buoyant, and they wind up becoming what we call a gas. No shape, right? No volume. The second word you should know is condensation. Condensation is when you cool molecules down and they tend to pack together more tightly. They go from being a gas to a liquid. And then precipitation is when those liquid droplets are more dense than the buoyant force of air that's holding them up. They fall to the ground as either rain or snow or sleet or whatever, right? And then you have water on the ground, right? So water either seeps into the ground and becomes groundwater, or water stays on the surface in lakes and oceans, or it may even seep deeper in the ground into aquifers, large deposits of underground water. And then again, evaporation, condensation, precipitation, runoff, evaporation. That's the water cycle. Where organisms come in is that we know plants use water, animals use water. Plants use water for photosynthesis. They take in water, carbon dioxide, and convert it into sugars. All right. So plants and animals both use water for their chemical reactions inside of their cells. One thing that we know about plants is that roots of plants, especially large plants like trees and things, uptake water. And because they're so big, they have to keep a constant motion of water moving up their xylem. Right? So usually what they do is through the leaves of the water, they are constantly, the leaves of the tree, they are constantly letting go of gaseous water vapor to keep this kind of pressure gradient moving. We call that transpiration. Transpiration. So that's probably the only new word term when it comes to water cycle. Is transpiration is the movement of water through plants, cycling from ground into atmosphere. The carbon cycle moves the atom carbon, and carbon is essential to life on Earth. It's one of those essential chemicals, and carbon is cycled through our ecosystems. Again, you find carbon stored in the ground. You have lots of carbon in the atmosphere. Usually it's carbon dioxide gas. You have carbon that's diffused or dissolved in water. Usually it's carbonic acid, right? And so this carbon gets recycled. And the two ways it's recycled is through photosynthesis and respiration, right? Photosynthesis, this is where plants use water and carbon dioxide to make sugar. The light reaction of photosynthesis is where they hold up water to sunlight, and sunlight blows it into pieces, blows it into oxygens, which they throw away, and into hydrogen ions, which they save to then stick on carbons that they've collected from the atmosphere. If you remember, plants typically collect carbons right from the atmosphere through little openings on the undersides of their leaves called stomata. stomata. Right? And so then carbon then is stored inside the body of the plant tissue as sugar. Right? Carbon's also stored inside of bodies of plants and animals in long chains called fatty acids. So we find carbon stored in a lot of different ways. Of course, how's that carbon then released to the atmosphere? Usually through respiration. It's kind of photosynthesis in reverse, where organisms like you and me will take glucose and we'll break them into pieces so that the little pieces we can use for break them into pieces so the energy stored in the bonds we can use to power ATP molecules. Right? We do that in the mitochondria of our cells. Right? You take glucose with oxygen, you break up through the Krebs cycle, you break up that glucose, and then down the electron transport train, you release hydrogen ions that turn on ATPs, and you get a whole ton of ATPs. And your waste product is carbon dioxide, which is released back into the atmosphere. All right, so the carbon cycle goes photosynthesis, respiration, photosynthesis, respiration. The third that I find most interesting is the nitrogen cycle. And this is probably the one that's most associated with living things, because nitrogen is an abundant chemical in the atmosphere. And nitrogen is important for making proteins. The problem is you can't just grab nitrogen out of the air and turn it into proteins. You need intermediaries, and that's how nitrogen cycles through the system, right? You've got nitrogen in the atmosphere. The first thing it's done is it has to be grabbed by nitrogen fixing bacteria that do what's called nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is when you take free nitrogen and ammonia and you basically switch the hydrogen ions for oxygens. Now they can be used by living systems, most importantly, plants. Plants, of course, take up the nitrogen, and I love this. It's totally complicated looking. They take up the nitrogen and they can turn nitrogen into various amino acids, right? And amino acids we know are the building blocks of proteins. So they can make lysine and proline and valine and arginine by doing different things with the nitrogen that they've gotten from nitrogen fixing bacteria who have released that nitrogen in a usable form as nitrates and nitrites into the soil. Plants pick them up, can play around with them and make the essential amino acids, which then the plants use for proteins to make things like enzymes and structural proteins and cell membrane proteins, you name it. Then, of course, along comes consumers. When they eat the plants, part of what they get out of it are the amino acids by eating plant proteins. Right, and there's 20 amino acids. You put them together to make proteins. Remember, DNA has the code to tell ribosomes how to put them together to make proteins. And proteins can be structural or enzymatic or membrane type proteins. And then when proteins are used up as a fuel, one of the things that happen is you release NH3 or ammonia. That becomes usually excreted as urine and it goes into the environment where it has to be fixed again so it can be reused by plants. Okay. So we got the nitrogen cycle, which goes from atmosphere through bacteria in the ground, through plants, animals, back up through bacteria, back into the atmosphere, and it cycles around and around and around. Nitrogen cycle. So the three cycles are water, carbon, and nitrogen that you'll need to know for Earth or the biology regions. All right, so enough for today. Let's do Ed Puzzle, and then we'll talk some more.